Look, I have been teaching combat methodology at the Vexarian Military Institute for 17 cycles now. 17 cycles of watching cadets fumble through basic strike patterns. 17 cycles of correcting stances. 17 cycles of wondering why the Galactic Council keeps sending me species that could not fight their way out of a protein synthesis chamber. But this human situation, this was going to be entertaining in ways I had not anticipated. The human's name was Marcus Webb. Yes, Webb. Not some dramatic designation. Not a complicated identifier with apostrophes and throat clicks. Just Webb. He stood in my gymnasium at exactly 0600 hours 3 minutes before class assembly, wearing the standard-issue training suit that somehow looked entirely wrong on his bipedal frame. Too tight across the shoulders. Too loose at the joint. Everything about humans seemed like a biological mistake wrapped in overconfidence. His file sat on my data tablet, glowing with red priority markers. Homeworld designation Earth. Gravity 1.03 standard. Atmospheric composition 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. The planet was classified, and I am not making this up, as a Class 9 Deathworld. Class 9. The same category as Krumath where it rains sulfuric acid. The same category as the Nox Prime, where the predators hunt in coordinated packs of 50. I read that designation 3 times, certain there had been a clerical error. Then I looked at Webb again, standing there with his hands loosely at his sides, examining my training equipment with what I can only describe as mild curiosity. This creature from a Class 9 Deathworld looked about as dangerous as a pluvian moss farmer. Instructor Krell, he said, and his translator rendered my name with perfect inflection. Permission to ask a question? Granted, I replied, already regretting it. Why is the gravity set to 0.75 standard? Is there a malfunction? Oh, this was going to be fun. The gravity was not malfunctioning. It was set to accommodate the majority of species in this training cohort. Vexarians like myself operated optimally at 0.8. The Thrin twins in the back row needed 0.65 or their exoskeletons cramped. The gravity was fine for everyone except, apparently, the human who grew up somewhere that should not support multicellular life. The gravity, I said slowly, is configured for optimal training conditions. Understood. Webb nodded once, then proceeded to rock back and forth on his feet, testing the resistance. I watched his leg muscles coil and release, adjusting to the difference with unsettling ease. Most species took days to acclimate to gravity shifts. This human looked like he was deciding whether he preferred tea or coffee. The rest of the class filtered in over the next few minutes. 23 cadets total, representing 12 different species, all here because they scored high enough on aptitude tests to warrant advanced combat training. The Thrin twins, Cax and Vax, clicked their mandibles at Webb, sizing him up. 3 Morganthian females clustered together, whispering in their musical language. A Quellan male named Dorthan made a show of stretching his forearms, each one corded with natural muscle that evolution spent millions of years perfecting. Webb stood alone, hands still loose, watching everyone with eyes that tracked movement like targeting systems. Brown eyes. Such a boring color for organs that seemed to process information at alarming rate. Formation. I barked, and 22 cadets snapped into position. Webb took 0.4 seconds longer, but his stance when he found it was textbook perfect. Feet shoulder width apart, weight balanced, center of gravity low. Someone had trained this human before he arrived at my academy. Today we begin practical application of Krell's third methodology, I announced, pacing in front of the formation. You will demonstrate your ability to respond to unexpected aggression with appropriate counterforce. This is not sparring. This is not exhibition. This is combat assessment. I saw several cadets swallow hard. Good. They should be nervous. Combat assessment meant I would attack them without warning, without mercy, and they would either respond correctly or end up in the medical wing explaining to the healers why they failed to block a strike they absolutely should have seen coming. Dorthan, I called out. Center mat. The Quellan moved forward, all forearms flexing in sequence. He was strong. I would give him that. His species evolved in heavy gravity forests, swinging between enormous trees, developing the kind of grip strength that could crush steel. He took his position and I circled him once, twice, letting anticipation build. Then, I struck, a simple straight punch aimed at his thorax. 3 of his arms came up in a defensive weave pattern while the 4th shot forward in a counterstrike. Inadequate. Not impressive, but adequate. I blocked his counter and stepped back. 72% efficiency, I told him. Your secondary left arm telegraphed your intention 0.3 seconds before execution. In real combat you would be compromised. Dorthan's skin flushed purple with embarrassment, but he nodded and returned to formation. I worked through 6 more cadets, finding flaws in each one. KX relied too heavily on his natural armor plating. One of the Morganthians had excellent technique but hesitated 0.2 seconds before committing. A Hepnar male named Grix had power but no precision, throwing strikes that would exhaust him in under a minute of sustained combat. Then I called Webb to the center mat. He walked forward with that same unhurried pace. No showboating, no false bravado, just steady movement that covered distance efficiently. He took his position 3 meters from me and I noticed something odd. His breathing had not changed. Not faster from anxiety, not slower from forced calm, just consistent, rhythmic, like his cardiovascular system was designed by engineers who understood optimal oxygen delivery. I decided to make this educational, not just for Webb but for the entire class. These cadets needed to understand that Deathworld designation or not, proper combat technique would always prevail over brute biological advantage. I would strike fast, strike hard, and demonstrate exactly why 17 cycles of teaching experience made me the superior combatant. I moved without warning, without the circling pattern I used with the others. My right hand shot forward in a throat strike that had dropped Morganthian warchiefs, the kind of blow that should have connected before Webb's primitive neural pathways could process the threat and signal his muscles to respond. Should have. His left hand came up, rotated inward, and his fingers wrapped around my wrist with enough pressure to completely arrest my forward momentum. Not blocking, not deflecting. Catch. He caught my strike like someone plucking fruit from a tree, and the kinetic energy I had put into that blow simply disappeared into his biomechanical structure. Time did a very strange thing then. It stretched out taffy-like, while my brain tried to process what my nerve endings were reporting. The human had not moved quickly. He had moved precisely. There was a difference. A critical difference that my 17 cycles of teaching experience suddenly seemed inadequate to explain. His brown eyes met mine and I saw something in them that made my secondary heart skip a beat. Not aggression, not fear, curiosity. Like he genuinely wanted to know what would happen next. Instructor Krell, Webb said, his voice perfectly modulated, perfectly calm. Has class begun? The gymnasium fell so silent I could hear the ventilation systems cycling air through the overhead ducts. 22 cadets stood frozen in formation, their various visual organs locked on the center mat where their instructor's strike was being held in place by a human who seemed entirely unbothered by the situation. I tugged my wrist experimentally. His grip did not loosen or tighten. It simply held, absolute and immovable, like my arm had been locked in a mechanical vise. My muscles strained and I felt the beginning of real resistance, not from trying to pull free but from the horrifying realization that I could not pull free, not without escalating to techniques that would be entirely inappropriate for a teaching demonstration. Release, I said quietly. Webb opened his hand immediately, stepping back to reset his stance. My wrist bore 5 small pressure marks where his fingers had been, already fading but definitely present. I rotated my joint, checking for damage, finding none but feeling the phantom sensation of that grip like an echo. The class remained silent. I had 2 options. Option 1, acknowledge what just happened and adjust my teaching methodology accordingly. Option 2, pretend this was all part of the lesson plan and maintain the appearance of control over my gymnasium. I chose option 3. Again I said. Webb tilted his head slightly, that same curious expression crossing his features. Instructor, that was the preliminary assessment. I lied smoothly. Now we test your response to sustained engagement. Defend yourself. I did not give him time to respond. I came in with a combination strike, right hand high, left hand low, both aimed at legitimate targets, both thrown with the kind of speed that should have overwhelmed his reaction time. Humans had slower neural transmission than Vexar. This was documented biological fact. Their signals had to travel farther through longer limbs. Their brains had to process visual information through primitive binocular vision. Webb's hands moved in a blur that should not have been possible for his species. He redirected my right strike with a rising forearm block that used my momentum against me, then pivoted his hips to create an angle that made my left strike pass harmlessly through empty space. I found myself off balance, overextended, and he was already resetting to neutral stance. I pressed the attack, throwing strikes in patterns I had perfected over cycles of training. Webb defended each one. Not with flashy technique, not with excessive movement, but with minimal efficiency that suggested someone had trained him very, very well. Or his species was very, very good at not dying, which given the Deathworld designation was becoming increasingly plausible. His counterattacks came without warning, testing strikes that forced me to defend, to move, to actually work for the first time in longer than I cared to admit. A front kick that would have collapsed my knee if I had not checked it, an elbow strike that whistled past my auditory sensors close enough to generate wind pressure. A sweep that almost took my legs out from under me. We separated, both breathing harder now, though Webb's respiration still maintained that mechanical consistency that was starting to annoy me. Sweat had appeared on his forehead, small beads of liquid that his body secreted for thermoregulation. Such a primitive cooling system, yet clearly effective enough to support extended physical exertion. Adequate defense, I managed to say. Your offense requires refinement. Understood, Instructor. Webb bowed slightly, a gesture from his homeworld that the translator did not bother converting. Should I return to formation? No. No, he should not return to formation. He should stay right here on this mat while I figured out what in the name of the Galactic Council's founding charter had just happened. But I could feel 22 pairs of various visual organs watching me, waiting to see how their instructor would handle being matched by a first-day cadet from a species none of them had ever encountered before. Return to formation, I said. We will continue individual assessments. Webb walked back to his position, and I saw several cadets lean away from him as he passed. Cax and Vax's mandibles had stopped clicking. The Morganthian females had stopped whispering. Even Dorthan, with all four of his powerful arms, looked at the human with new respect, or possibly fear. I was beginning to understand those two things might be closely related where humans were concerned. I continued the assessments, working through the remaining cadets with half my attention, while the other half kept cycling back to those 5 pressure marks on my wrist. Webb stood in formation, hands loose at his sides, watching each demonstration with that same patient curiosity. Learn analyzing, processing. The class ended at 07:30, and I dismissed the cadets with instructions to review Krell's third methodology in preparation for tomorrow's session. They filed out in small groups, talking in hushed tones, occasionally glancing back at Webb, who gathered his gear without apparent awareness of the attention. Cadet Webb, I called out before he reached the exit. He stopped, turned, approached. Yes. Instructor, your previous combat training. Where did you receive it? Earth, sir. Mandatory service at 18 standard years. I completed advanced infantry qualification before receiving my commission. Advanced infantry. I tested the words. And what does that entail on a Class 9 Deathworld? Webb considered the question with that maddening calm. Survival training in hostile environments. Close quarters combat. Weapons proficiency. Strategic and tactical analysis. Standard curriculum. Standard. He called training that let him catch my strike standard curriculum. And how long did this standard curriculum last? 16 weeks for basic. 20 for advanced qualification. Then 2 years of field deployment before I qualified for off-world academy applications. I did some quick calculations in my head. Webb was 24 standard years old according to his file. That meant he had been training for combat since he was barely an adult by human standards, in conditions that would kill most species I knew, against threats I could not begin to imagine. Dismissed, I said. Webb nodded once and left, his footfalls quiet even in the reduced gravity. I stood alone in my gymnasium, looking at my wrist, rotating the joint slowly. The pressure marks had faded completely now, but I could still feel them. Still feel that absolute certainty in his grip, that calm competence that suggested he had been holding back considerably during our exchange. My data tablet chimed with an incoming message. Academy Administration asking for my preliminary assessment of the new human cadet. I stared at the blinking notification for a long moment, then began typing my response. This was going to be an interesting semester. I did not sleep well that night. This is worth mentioning because Vexarians typically have excellent sleep cycles, evolutionary advantage from our predator ancestry that allowed us to rest efficiently between hunts. But I spent 6 hours staring at my ceiling panels, replaying that moment when Webb caught my strike, analyzing the biomechanics, trying to understand how a species with documented slower neural transmission had reacted faster than I could process. The Academy database became my obsession around hour 3. I pulled every file on humans that our intelligence services had compiled. It was not much. Earth had only made official contact with the Galactic Council 8 standard years ago, and their species was still considered probationary members. Most of what we knew came from initial survey data and the handful of humans who had ventured off-world for trade or education. But there were notes. Oh, there were notes. A medical report from a Pluvian doctor who treated a human construction worker. The doctor had written, and I quote, "Patient required minor surgery for a compound fracture. Patient remained conscious and conversational throughout the procedure. Declined in aesthetic. Stated the pain was manageable compared to a previous injury involving something called a motorcycle accident. I do not understand this species." A xenobiology study on human muscle fiber composition. Apparently they had a higher percentage of something called fast twitch muscles compared to most spacefaring species, allowing for explosive power generation. The researcher noted this was likely an adaptation for pursuit, predation, and throwing weapons with lethal accuracy. Throwing weapons. They evolved to kill things by throwing rocks hard enough to cause traumatic injury. A cultural analysis written by a very confused Morganthian anthropologist. Humans engage in recreational combat for entertainment purposes. They call it sports. They strike each other repeatedly in designated areas while crowds observe and celebrate. When asked why, the response was it builds character. I remain uncertain what character is built by repeated blunt force trauma to the cranium. I read until my visual organs burned, then read some more. Every file painted the same picture. Humans were durable, aggressive, adaptable, and apparently viewed pain as a teaching tool rather than a deterrent. Their military history was particularly enlightening. They had been killing each other with increasing efficiency for thousands of years, developing weapons, tactics, and strategies in an endless cycle of conflict that made our own species' wars look like territorial disagreements, and we had admitted them to the Galactic Council. We had looked at this species of persistent predators from a death world and said, yes, welcome to the community of civilized spacefaring peoples. The absurdity almost made me laugh. Morning formation at 0600 found me standing in my gymnasium again, watching cadets file in. Webb arrived exactly 3 minutes early, same as yesterday, taking the same position. He nodded politely to the Thrin twins, who now gave him noticeably more space in formation. Word had spread. Of course it had. 22 witnesses to an instructor being matched by a first-day cadet. That was the kind of gossip that traveled through academy dormitories at faster than light speeds. I could see it in the way other cadets watched Webb, could hear it in the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Formation. I called, and they snapped to attention. Well, 22 of them snapped. Webb settled into attention with that same efficient movement. No wasted energy, no theatrical precision. Just getting from point A to point B effectively. Today we progressed to Krell's fourth methodology, I announced. Sparring with graduated resistance. You will pair off by weight class and demonstrate practical application of yesterday's lessons. I will observe and correct. I deliberately did not pair Webb with anyone. Not yet. I wanted to watch him work with someone else first. See how he adapted his technique against different species with different advantages. Also, I was not ready to admit I needed time to develop a strategy for the second encounter we both knew was coming. The Thrin twins paired together, which made sense given they were the only ones with exoskeletons. Dorthan accepted a Morganthian female named Lyra as his partner, all 4 of his arms against her superior reach and flexibility. The others sorted themselves into reasonable matchups, leaving Webb standing alone. Cadet Webb, I said, you will observe this round. Note the techniques each pairing employs. Yes, instructor. He moved to the observation area, and I swear I felt the collective relief from several cadets who had been dreading the possibility of facing him. Smart. They were learning. The sparring began, and I circulated between pairs, offering corrections and adjustments. Cax was still relying too much on his natural armor. Lyra had improved her commitment timing but needed to work on recovery speed. A Hepnar female named Quinn showed promising aggression but poor target selection. Webb watched everything with those tracking eyes, his head turning to follow exchanges, processing multiple fights simultaneously. I caught him twice mouthing along with corrections I gave other cadets, memorizing the information, cataloging it for future application. Intelligent. They had not mentioned in the files that humans were this intelligent. Or maybe they had and I had been too focused on the Deathworld designation to pay attention. Rotation. I called after 15 minutes. Switch partners. New matchups. The cadets reorganized themselves and I made my decision. Cadet Dorthan, you will partner with Cadet Webb this round. Dorthan's skin flushed that purple color again, but he moved to the center mat without protest. Webb joined him, and they bowed to each other in the traditional pre-sparring acknowledgement. The Quellan stood a full head taller than the human, outweighed him by at least 40 kilograms, and had twice as many striking limbs. On paper this should not be competitive. Begin, I said. Dorthan opened with his standard combination, all four arms working in coordinated sequence to create overlapping fields of attack that were nearly impossible to defend against. Webb slipped left, ducked under a high strike, redirected a middle strike with his forearm, and somehow found the gap between attacks to deliver a sharp kick to Dorthan's lead leg. The Quellan stumbled, his coordination disrupted, and Webb pressed forward with hand strikes that forced all four arms into defensive positions. They exchanged attacks for 30 seconds. Dorthan's superior limb count versus Webb's superior efficiency, and I watched something fascinating happen. Webb was learning. Mid-fight he was analyzing Dorthan's patterns, identifying the 0.3-second telegraph I had mentioned yesterday, and timing his counters to exploit it. By the 45-second mark he was landing 2 strikes for every one of Dorthan's, and the Quellan's purple flush had deepened to almost violet. "Halt," I called. They separated, both breathing hard. Dorthan looked frustrated. Webb looked thoughtful. "Cadet Webb, your assessment of that exchange?" "Cadet Dorthan has excellent coordination between all 4 limbs," Webb said. "But his secondary left arm initiates each combination sequence 0.3 seconds before the others. Once I identified the pattern, I could anticipate his attacks and counter appropriately." Silence in the gymnasium. Every cadet had stopped their own sparring to listen. I had just told Dorthan that exact weakness yesterday, and Webb had not only remembered it, he had weaponized it in under a minute of combat. "Cadet Dorthan," I said. "Your assessment?" The Quellan worked his jaw, mandibles clicking softly. "The human is faster than he should be, Instructor. His species' neural transmission speed is documented as slower than standard, but his reactions suggest otherwise." "Adrenaline response," Webb offered quietly. "Human adrenal glands produce a hormone cocktail during stress that increases reaction time, pain tolerance, and strength output. It is temporary but significant." "You are experiencing this adrenaline response now?" I asked. "Yes, Instructor. Have been since the sparring began." "And you maintain cognitive function during this state?" "Yes, Instructor. The hormone release enhances physical capability without significantly impairing judgment. It is a standard combat response for my species, a standard combat response. Humans walked around with built-in performance enhancement that activated automatically during fights. This seemed unfair on a level I lacked the vocabulary to properly express. I rotated the pairs twice more, giving Webb different opponents with the different advantages. Against Cax, he adapted to the exoskeleton armor by targeting joints and weak points. Against Lyra, he matched her superior reach with better footwork and angle creation. Against Quinn, he absorbed her aggressive attacks and countered during her recovery phases. He won every exchange, not through overwhelming force, not through superior genetics, but through analysis and adaptation. Every opponent taught him something, and he incorporated those lessons immediately into his next engagement. By the end of class, the other cadets were exhausted. Webb was sweating more heavily than yesterday, his training suit dark with moisture, but his breathing remained controlled and his stance solid. "Dismissed," I told the class. "Review Krell's 4th methodology tonight. Tomorrow we introduce weapons familiarization." The cadets filed out in their small groups again, giving Webb even more space now. He had gone from unknown quantity to verified threat in a single training session. I saw respect in their eyes. Yes, but also wariness. They were beginning to understand what I had learned yesterday. Humans were dangerous. "Cadet Webb, remain." He stopped at the exit again, turned, approached. That same patient walk. "Yes, Instructor." I gestured to the center mat. He followed without question, taking his position 3 meters away. We stood there for a moment, instructor and student, Vexoran and human, both knowing what came next. "Your performance today was exceptional," I said. "Thank you, Instructor. But you held back against every opponent." His expression did not change, but something flickered in those brown eyes. Recognition, maybe, or respect for the observation. "I did not want to injure my classmates, Instructor. This is training, not combat." "And yesterday, when you caught my strike?" "That was reflex, Instructor. You attacked without warning. My body responded before my conscious mind could moderate the reaction." "Reflex." He had stopped an instructor-level attack through reflex. I remembered the files I read last night, the notes about pursuit, predation, and throwing weapons, and thousands of years of increasingly efficient violence. "Show me," I said. "Instructor, show me what you are capable of without moderating your reactions. No holding back, no concern for injury, just combat." Webb studied me for a long moment, and I saw calculation happening behind his eyes. Risk assessment, consequence evaluation, the kind of thinking that separated soldiers from civilians. "Instructor Krell, he said slowly. I appreciate the opportunity, but I do not think that would be appropriate in a training environment. I am ordering you, cadet. With respect, sir. No, the refusal hung in the air between us. Insubordination, technically, grounds for disciplinary action, but also wisdom, the kind that came from understanding exactly how much damage he could cause, and choosing not to cause it. I felt something shift in my perception of this human. He was not just dangerous. He was controlled, disciplined, aware of his capabilities and willing to restrain them even when given explicit permission to cut loose. That made him more dangerous, not less. Then we continue as we did yesterday, I said. Graduated escalation. I attack, you defend. We both learn where the boundaries are. Yes, instructor. I came at him with the same opening strike, the throat shot that had worked on Morganthian war chiefs. His left hand rose, caught my wrist, held it immobile, but this time I was ready. I pivoted, used the trapped limb as a fulcrum, brought my left elbow around toward his temple. Webb released my wrist, ducked under the elbow strike and delivered a palm strike to my solar plexus that drove the air from my lungs. Not hard enough to injure, just hard enough to demonstrate he could. We reset. I attacked again. Combinations, feints, legitimate techniques designed to overwhelm his defense. He handled each one, sometimes blocking, sometimes redirecting, occasionally countering with strikes that stopped millimeters from actual contact. Teaching strikes, showing me where I was vulnerable without exploiting those vulnerabilities. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 15. My muscles burned. My respiration labored. Sweat matted my uniform to my carapace. Webb's condition had degraded too, that moisture secretion system working overtime, but he maintained his defensive posture with infuriating consistency. Finally I stepped back, hands raised in the traditional cessation signal. Enough. We both stood there, breathing hard, and I noticed something. Webb was smiling. Not a large expression, just a slight curve at the corners of his mouth. Enjoyment. He had enjoyed that exchange. You are smiling, I observed. My apologies, instructor. It has been some time since I had a proper training partner. I appreciate the opportunity. A proper training partner. He considered me, a decorated combat instructor with 17 cycles of teaching experience, a proper training partner. The audacity should have offended me. Instead, I found myself oddly pleased by the assessment. Your technique is exceptional, I admitted. Where did you say you received your advanced training? Earth, sir. But I continued studying after my commission. Humans have developed hundreds of martial systems over thousands of years. I have practiced 7 different styles trying to synthesize the most effective elements from each. 7 different martial systems. Thousands of years of development. Humans had been perfecting violence as an art form since before most council species achieved spaceflight. And these systems, I asked, they are common knowledge on your world? Yes. Instructor, many humans study martial arts recreationally. Some schools have been teaching the same techniques for over 1,000 years, passing knowledge from teacher to student in an unbroken chain. Recreational violence study. 1,000-year-old teaching lineages, unbroken chains of increasingly efficient combat knowledge. This was the species we had admitted to the Galactic Council. I thought about those files again, about the motorcycle accidents and sports-related head trauma and all the ways humans seemed determined to injure themselves for character building. Then I looked at Webb standing patient and respectful, deadly and disciplined in equal measure. Dismissed Cadet Webb. Excellent work today. Thank you, instructor. He bowed again, gathered his gear and left. I stood alone in my gymnasium for the 2nd day in a row, rotating my wrist even though it bore no marks this time. Tomorrow we introduced weapons familiarization. Tomorrow I would see what a human could do with tools designed to extend lethal capability. I was looking forward to it, and that, perhaps more than anything else, told me exactly how much this human had already changed my understanding of combat instruction. In 2 days, Webb had transformed from an unknown variable into the most interesting teaching challenge I had encountered in 17 cycles. My data tablet chimed. Administration again, asking for an updated assessment. I stared at the screen, considering my response. Then I typed 7 words. Request human combat methodology be added to curriculum. I hit send, before I could reconsider, already imagining the confusion that message would generate. But I had seen enough. Webb was not an outlier. He was a representative sample. If one human could perform like this, what could a unit of them accomplish? What could a species of them achieve? The Galactic Council had no idea what they had invited to the table. But I was beginning to understand. And honestly, I could not wait for tomorrow's class.